Welcome to Noir Street, a channel where every story carries a mystery or something even darker. Our community may be small, so please subscribe to the channel. Give this video a like and tell us in the comments which part of the world you're watching from. Now let's begin the story. Chapter 1. The empty space under the tree Christmas morning has a peculiar gift for exposing absences. Not the forgivable kind, the absence of tact in a relative who speaks too freely, or the absence of cheer in a man who overindulged the night before, but the kind that insists on being noticed, the sort of absence that sits squarely in the middle of a room and dares you to ignore it. At the Hollister townhouse on East 72nd Street, that absence had been wrapped in green paper, tied with a red ribbon, and labeled with a name which made it not only conspicuous, but improper. I saw it before the eggs. That point deserves emphasis, because my loyalty to breakfast is one of my few unshakable principles. But years with Nero Wolfe have trained my eye to notice imbalance before appetite asserts itself. The moment I stepped into the drawing room, coffee in hand, something felt off. I took in the room automatically, the way I always do, cataloguing details without quite meaning to. The Hollisters had prepared the room with ceremonial precision. Chairs were arranged in polite clusters, angled just enough to suggest conversation, but not comfort. A fire burned steadily in the marble fireplace, more decorative than warming. Evergreen garlands lined the mantel, symmetrically arranged, and the faint scent of pine competed with furniture, polish, and money. The Christmas tree stood near the bay window, tall and full, lights still glowing softly, as though it hadn't yet received the memo that morning had arrived. Glass ornaments reflected the room in dozens of miniature distortions, each one a tiny, crooked witness. Beneath the tree lay the gifts. They were arranged neatly, deliberately, as if their positions had been considered and approved. Nothing haphazard. Each package was wrapped in tasteful paper, each tied with careful bows, each tagged in the same restrained hand. Mrs. Eleanor Hollister's names only. No jokes, no hearts, no exclamation points. This was a household where sentiment was allowed, but only under supervision. And then there was the space. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't something you could miss unless you were determined not to see it. It sat between a square red package addressed to Claire and a long, narrow one meant for young Peter. The carpet there was bare, its fibers slightly flattened, like a memory pressed into wool. Whatever had been there had stayed long enough to leave a mark. I stared at it until I was sure it wasn't my imagination. "There should be another one," I said. No one answered. That wasn't surprising. On Christmas morning, people are trained to hear only approved sounds, laughter, praise, the tearing of paper. Anything else is filtered out as inappropriate. I raised my voice, just enough to cross the threshold of politeness. There should be another package under the tree. That got results. Mrs. Eleanor Hollister turned slowly, with the controlled precision of a woman who did not care to be interrupted. She was tall, erect, and impeccably dressed in green silk, with pearls at her throat and authority in every line of her posture. Her grey hair was swept back as if rebellion had never occurred to it. If Christmas had softened her at all, it had done so grudgingly. "What do you mean, Mr. Goodwin?" she asked. I gestured with my coffee cup. "That space there. Between Claire's and Peter's there was a package there last night. Medium size, green paper, red ribbon. The tag said, Marcus." Marcus Hollister reacted as though someone had plucked a wire attached to his nerves. He was a trim man in his early 40s, well-dressed, well-groomed, and permanently alert. His frown suggested a man trying to recall a detail he had assumed was beneath his notice. "There was," he said. "Yes," his sister Claire said immediately. "I remember it. I tied the ribbon myself." Claire Hollister Keene had a pleasant face and a soft voice that encouraged underestimation. She was seated on the arm of a chair, cradling her coffee with both hands, her eyes moving calmly around the room. She noticed things, I decided, but preferred not to announce them unless forced. Marcus shook his head. "I don't remember seeing it." "That's because you were on the phone," his wife Julia said, without looking at him. Julia Hollister was small, dark-haired, and precise. She stood slightly apart from the others, as though maintaining a boundary, Everything about her suggested order, her posture, her tone, even the way she folded her hands. "I was?" Marcus asked. "Yes," Julia replied. "You were talking to Chicago about the merger." Marcus frowned deeper. That told me the merger was either important or troublesome, possibly both. Mrs. Eleanor Hollister made a sound that hovered between a sigh and a dismissal. "This is nonsense. If a gift is missing, it has been moved. We are not going to begin Christmas morning with foolishness." "I'd be happy to agree," I said, "except no one admits touching it, and everyone remembers it being there last night." The room paused. The tree lights hummed softly, somewhere upstairs. The house creaked as it settled into daylight. Peter Hollister spoke up. "I saw it when I went to bed. It was there. This morning it's gone." Peter was 13 and earnest, and his expression held curiosity rather than fear. He hadn't yet learned how uncomfortable family situations could become. "That settles it," Mrs. Eleanor Hollister said crisply. "Somebody moved it. We will look for it later." "That would make sense," I said, "if this were a larger house with fewer people, but everyone here was present last night." Claire tilted her head. "Are you suggesting someone took it?" "I'm suggesting someone removed it," I said. "Whether they intended to keep it remains to be seen." "For a joke?" Claire asked. "People do odd things on holidays," I said. "They feel permitted." Marcus let out a short laugh that lacked conviction. "On Christmas?" "Especially on Christmas," I said. Mrs. Eleanor Hollister fixed her gaze on me. "Mr. Goodwin, I am not accustomed to having my household questioned by guests." I smiled pleasantly. "Then you shouldn't have invited my employer." That shifted the focus like a dropped glass. At the far end of the room, Nero Wolfe sat in a chair chosen for durability rather than beauty. He wore his brown suit, freshly pressed, and regarded the scene with composed interest. He had remained silent, allowing events to ripen to the point where intervention became inevitable. He set down his coffee cup carefully. "I warned you, madam," he said. "An anomaly invites inquiry. Inquiry produces discomfort." Mrs. Eleanor Hollister straightened. "Mr. Wolfe, this is a family gathering." "Reality," Wolfe replied, "does not respect occasions. A gift addressed to your son has vanished. That is a fact." Marcus shifted his stance. "With respect, sir, this could be nothing." "Indeed," Wolfe said. "It could be nothing. It could also be significant. The distinction will not be resolved by ignoring it." Julia spoke quietly. "What was in the package?" For a moment, no one answered. Mrs. Eleanor Hollister hesitated, an unfamiliar sight. "It was something personal," she said finally. "For Marcus." Wolfe's eyes sharpened. "Personal gifts are rarely inconsequential." Marcus said sharply, "Mother." She waved him off. "It was an heirloom, something that belonged to your father, that carried weight. Heirlooms bring history into the room, whether invited or not." "And now it's gone," Claire said. "Yes," Wolfe said, "and it was taken deliberately." Mrs. Eleanor Hollister bristled. "You have no proof." "I have probability," Wolfe replied. "A wrapped package does not misplace itself." Julia folded her arms. "You mean one of us?" "I mean someone present," Wolfe said calmly. The air cooled. "This is intolerable," Mrs. Eleanor Hollister said. "On the contrary," Wolfe replied, "it is inevitable." I checked my watch. Breakfast was already late, and in my experience, that was the first sign that a peaceful holiday had been officially cancelled. "Well," I said, "we might as well establish when everyone last saw it." They answered after dinner. "After drinks, after the carols. It had been there when the lights were turned off." Their stories aligned neatly, which meant if there was a lie, it was well hidden. Wolfe listened, eyes half closed, fingers steepled. "Very well," he said at last. "We will proceed, Mr. Goodwin will observe. I will deduce by the end of the day. The truth will be apparent." Mrs. Eleanor Hollister stared at him. "On Christmas Day?" "Especially on Christmas Day," Wolfe said. I looked again at the empty space beneath the tree. It stared back at me, silent and accusing. Somewhere in that house was a gift that had broken the rules, and I knew from experience that when something goes missing before breakfast, the rest of the day rarely improves. I finished my coffee and accepted that the eggs would be cold. Trouble, unlike gifts, never waits to be unwrapped. Chapter 2. The body by the stairwell. If Christmas morning has a talent for exposing absences, then Christmas noon has a darker, more perverse habit. It supplies replacements no one asked for, no one is prepared to accept, and no one can possibly return. By 11:30, the Hollister townhouse had settled into that brittle imitation of normality people adopt when admitting that something is wrong feels more dangerous than pretending it isn't. The Christmas tree lights had finally been switched off, though the ornaments still caught the pale winter daylight, filtering through the bay window, and scattered it around the room in cold, glittering fragments. Several gifts remained unopened beneath the tree, ignored now as if they belonged to a celebration that had been quietly cancelled without explanation. They looked embarrassed to still be there. Breakfast, late, lukewarm, and unloved, had been cleared away with unnecessary efficiency. Plates vanished. Cups were stacked and removed. Crumbs were wiped from the table with more force than required. The dining room stood bare and faintly accusatory, its polished surface reflecting nothing but restraint. No one mentioned lunch. No one consulted the clock. Time had become an inconvenience. Something better left alone. Nero Wolfe had taken possession of the library, the farthest point from the kitchen, and in his judgment, the only room in the house with respectable proportions. He was enduring the coffee with stoic displeasure, using it as a private exercise in patience, and pretending not to notice the tension that traveled through the house like a low electrical current. I had been doing what I always do when walls begin to feel crowded with secrets, making a slow, purposeless circuit, listening more than looking, letting people believe I was simply stretching my legs and not taking notes. I was halfway up the back staircase, considering whether the guest bathroom might be willing to share any confidences beyond clean towels and polite plumbing, when the scream tore through the house. It was sharp, sudden, unmistakably human, and it came from above. For a fraction of a second, there was silence. An awful, suspended pause where the house seemed to inhale, then the sound of running feet, a hoarse shout, and finally a name spoken with naked terror. Marcus. I didn't hesitate. I took the remaining steps 2 at a time, my mind already discarding hopeful explanations. Experience has taught me that optimism wastes time, and mercy, when it comes, is usually late and apologetic. I reached the second-floor landing just as Julia Hollister came into view at the top of the main stairwell. She stood rigid, one hand clamped over her mouth, the other gripping the banister with white-knuckled desperation. Her eyes were fixed downward, wide and unblinking, as though she feared that if she looked away even briefly, the scene would rearrange itself into something even worse. Claire was just behind her, pale and breathless, her lips parted as if she were trying, and failing, to form words that could handle what she was seeing. At the bottom of the stairs lay Marcus Hollister. He was sprawled awkwardly on his side, his body twisted in a way that suggested gravity had arranged him without consultation. One arm was folded beneath his torso at an angle that made my shoulder ache just looking at it. His head was turned slightly toward the wall, and above his right ear was a dark, brutal wound, ragged at the edges, unmistakable in its finality. Blood had pooled on the polished wood floor, spreading slowly, already losing its shine as it cooled and thickened, seeping into the seams between boards that had never expected to remember it. Marcus was not moving. He was not going to. Beside him, placed with care, not dropped, not jostled, was the missing gift. The green wrapping paper was immaculate. The red ribbon lay smooth and perfect, the bow tied with deliberate precision, the tag bearing Marcus in Mrs. Eleanor Hollister's neat, restrained handwriting, was unstained. It looked less like a forgotten package and more like an exhibit, positioned for inspection, angled just enough to be noticed immediately. The contrast was obscene. For a long moment, no one moved. The house itself seemed to hesitate, as though startled by what it had produced and unsure how to proceed. Even the air felt heavier, reluctant to circulate. Mrs. Eleanor Hollister appeared behind me, pushing past with a sharp intake of breath that never quite became sound. She reached the railing, looked down, and something in her posture shifted. Not collapsed. Mrs. Eleanor Hollister did not collapse, but bent just enough to be visible to anyone who knew how to look. "My son," she said. The words sounded small, stripped of command and authority, and that alone was shocking. Julia made a low, broken sound that might have been Marcus's name, or might have been something older and less articulate. Her knees gave way, and she sank onto the top step, one hand still clutched to her mouth, as though physically holding the sound inside her. Claire moved automatically, slipping an arm around her shoulders, though her own eyes never left the scene below, as if memorizing it against her will. This was the moment when chaos usually insists on taking over, when everyone speaks at once or moves in the wrong direction. Chaos is ambitious that way, but it can be managed if you interrupt it early and speak loudly enough. "Everyone, stay where you are," I said firmly. "Don't touch anything." Mrs. Eleanor Hollister's head snapped toward me, outrage briefly overtaking shock. "Who do you think?" "I think," I said, cutting in before momentum could build, "that if anyone moves that body or that package, Wolfe will have my head and the police will have the rest of you, so please, stay exactly where you are." Authority recognizes authority, even when it resents it. She stopped, gripping the railing, as though it were an argument she could win later. I descended the stairs carefully, keeping close to the wall, avoiding the widening pool of blood. I knelt beside Marcus, more out of obligation than hope. The wound told its story efficiently, a single, forceful blow delivered with enough precision, or indifference, to end matters instantly. There were no defensive injuries, no sign of a struggle. Whatever had happened, it had been swift, decisive, and final. I straightened and examined the package again. It had been aligned parallel to Marcus's body, close enough to establish connection, far enough to avoid contact. The ribbon hadn't shifted. The paper showed no wrinkles from hurried handling. Whoever placed it there had not been rushed. They had time, and they had purpose. This wasn't panic. This was presentation. I climbed the stairs again, feeling the weight of eyes on my back, and headed straight for the library. Wolfe was exactly where I had left him, a book open on his lap, his expression one of patient dissatisfaction. He looked up as I entered, took in my face, and closed the ledger carefully, as though marking a place he fully intended to return to when the world allowed it. "Yes," he said. "We've found Marcus," I said. "Bottom of the main stairs. He's dead, head injury." Wolfe's eyes sharpened fractionally. "And the gift? It's with him," I said, placed carefully, like an exhibit. Wolfe absorbed that in silence, then rose with the deliberate effort of a man who prefers not to hurry unless circumstances insist. "Then the situation has progressed," he said. "Lead on." The family was still clustered at the top, suspended in various stages of disbelief and shock. Wolfe surveyed the scene slowly, methodically, body, wound, blood, package, his gaze moving with unhurried precision and unsettling calm, as though this were a problem laid out for study rather than a tragedy unfolding in real time. "This," he said at last, "is deliberate." Mrs. Eleanor Hollister turned on him, pain sharpening her voice. "My son is dead." "Yes," Wolfe agreed. "And someone wished him to be discovered in this manner." Julia lifted her head slightly, her face drained of color. "You think the gift matters?" Wolfe inclined his head. "It matters more than the body." That landed hard, like a second blow delivered without apology. I cleared my throat. "The police should be called." "Yes," Wolfe said, "but not yet." Mrs. Eleanor Hollister stared at him as if reason itself had just stepped out of the room. "Not yet. The scene is intact," Wolfe replied calmly. "And the killer is present. Once the police arrive, they will disrupt both." "That's madness," Claire said hoarsely. "No," Wolfe said. "It is efficiency." I looked again at the gift. Whatever lay inside had vanished once, returned with ceremony, and now served as silent commentary on a death it had not caused. Marcus Hollister had not been killed by the gift, but someone had wanted it there, to accuse, to remind, or to promise. Anne, standing in that hushed stairwell, with blood drying on polished wood and Christmas, waiting awkwardly in the next room. I had the uneasy certainty that the gift had not yet finished saying what it came to say. Chapter 3. A house full of motives if death has a sound. It isn't the scream that announces it, it's the silence that follows. The deliberate, weighty quiet that moves into a house and settles there like an unwanted tenant who has paid in advance and intends to stay indefinitely. By mid-afternoon, the Hollister townhouse had acquired that silence in full measure. It pressed against walls and ceilings, flattened voices, and made every footstep sound louder than it should have. Doors closed more carefully. Conversations ended sooner than intended. Even the heating pipes seemed to restrain themselves, ticking and sighing with unusual discretion. The stairwell remained untouched, guarded not by tape or uniforms, but by a collective reluctance to acknowledge what waited there. Marcus Hollister lay where he had fallen, now covered with a throw fetched from the library, as though dignity could be restored by wool. The gift remained beside him, untouched, unquestioned, present in a way the body no longer was. Nero Wolfe decided the family would gather. He chose the drawing room, and as usual, he offered no explanation. He never does when the reasons are obvious. The room was large, formal, and unforgiving. Windows along one wall, doors along another, and a wide arch that led back toward the hall. It offered no comfortable corners and no shadows, deep enough to hide in. Wolfe appreciates spaces that make people visible whether they wish to be or not. They assembled slowly, reluctantly, like chess pieces nudged into position by a hand they could not see. No one chose the chair they had occupied that morning. Chairs were selected with care, distances measured without conscious thought. Grief rearranges furniture faster than decorators ever could. Mrs. Eleanor Hollister took her place first. She sat straight, backed, hands folded tightly in her lap, as though physical pressure were the only thing holding her together. Her face had settled into a pale mask of control, the expression of a woman who had decided collapse was not an option available to her. Her eyes were dry, sharp, and vigilant, as though she were still presiding over something rather than enduring it. If grief broke through, it would do so later, privately, and on her terms. Julia Hollister sat near the window, close enough to the light to avoid shadows. Her eyes were red, her mouth drawn tight, but her posture was rigid with exhaustion rather than hysteria. Grief weighed on her heavily, but so did something else, fatigue, deep and chronic, the kind that doesn't begin with a tragedy and doesn't end when one is acknowledged. She held a handkerchief loosely in her fingers, as though it were more habit than necessity, and her gaze drifted occasionally to the floor, then away again, as if the act of looking required negotiation. Claire Keene chose a chair near the fireplace. She sat upright, ankles crossed neatly, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles showed white. Her face was composed, but the muscles along her jaw betrayed tension. She looked like someone determined to be reasonable in a situation that resisted reason on principle. Every so often her eyes flicked toward her mother, and then back to Wolfe, as if measuring the distance between obligation and truth. Across from her sat Leonard Pike. Pike was Marcus Hollister's business partner, and if resentment had a posture, it might have borrowed his. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, as though perpetually arguing a point he believed the world was unfairly ignoring. His thinning hair was rumpled, his jaw tight, his eyes restless. He had arrived mid-morning, summoned by a phone call that had likely been short and alarming, and he carried himself like a man who had already done the arithmetic and disliked the total. He looked less shocked than irritated, which is sometimes worse. Near the door stood Thomas Hollister, Marcus's younger brother. He declined a chair at first, pacing in short, sharp lines until Wolfe lifted an eyebrow. That stopped him. Thomas dropped into a chair with ill grace, legs stretched out, hands clasping and unclasping restlessly. He had the nervous energy of a man accustomed to borrowing trouble and calling it opportunity. His suit was expensive, his tie loosened, his shoes polished just enough to suggest effort without commitment. Confidence clung to him by habit rather than conviction. Peter had been sent upstairs, officially to rest. In truth, Wolfe had excluded him. Children complicate matters, and Wolfe has no patience for complications that do not advance the problem. I doubted Peter was resting. Children hear more than adults think. Wolfe seated himself last, centrally and expansively, as though the room had been designed with him in mind. He folded his hands over his stomach and regarded the assembled group with calm, impersonal interest. I took up my usual position nearby, leaning casually against the back of a chair, my notebook conspicuously absent. People speak more freely when they think you're not recording them. You are gathered, Wolfe said, his voice filling the room without effort, because Marcus Hollister is dead. You are also gathered because the object placed beside his body, the gift, demonstrates intention. We will discuss both. No one objected. Silence, once established, enforces cooperation better than shouting ever could. Each of you, Wolfe continued, will describe your relationship with the deceased briefly, truthfully, Mr. Hollister. His gaze settled on Thomas. You may begin. Thomas cleared his throat. Marcus was my brother. That is insufficient, Wolfe said mildly. Thomas flushed, color rising sharply in his cheeks. We worked together sometimes. He helped me out. With money, Wolfe supplied. Thomas's jaw tightened. Yes. How much? Wolfe asked. Thomas hesitated. Not long, but long enough to be noticed. His eyes flicked briefly toward his mother, then away again, as if the figure lived somewhere between them. Nina, he said. Wolfe nodded. Debt produces motive, not proof. Sit. Thomas slumped back, irritation simmering beneath embarrassment. His foot began to tap, stopped, then started again in a slower, more deliberate rhythm, as if he were coaching himself toward calm. Mr. Pike, Wolfe said. Pike leaned forward eagerly, seizing the opportunity. Marcus and I built the company together, Hollister and Pike Holdings from nothing. And recently, Wolfe said, you disagreed. Pike's mouth twisted. He wanted to edge me out, reduce my influence, turn me into a name on the letterhead. Legally, Wolfe asked. Not yet, Pike snapped. But I could see it coming. He was laying the groundwork. Resentment, Wolfe said, a fertile soil. Sit. Pike sat back, scowling, his fingers drumming against his knee in an uneven rhythm that suggested irritation more than nerves. He did not look at the others. Mrs. Eleanor Hollister, Wolfe said. She lifted her chin. Marcus was my son. Yes, Wolfe said. And he was everything his father expected him to be. The room absorbed that quietly. Expectation has weight, and it tends to settle unevenly, leaving marks. Expectation, Wolfe said, is a heavy inheritance. Mrs. Eleanor Hollister's lips pressed together. But she did not look away. Her hands remained tightly folded, knuckles pale. Wolfe turned to Julia, Mrs. Eleanor Hollister. Julia drew a slow breath. Marcus was my husband. And recently? Wolfe prompted. She closed her eyes briefly. Distant, tired. We were both tired. Of what? Wolfe asked. Of holding things together, she said softly. Of pretending nothing was wrong when it was. Wolfe studied her for a long moment. Exhaustion does not eliminate motive, he said. Nor does it create it. Julia nodded once, as though acknowledging a conclusion she had already reached and disliked. Finally, Wolfe turned to Claire. Claire Keene. She met his gaze steadily. Marcus was my brother, we argued. We reconciled, like siblings do. And the gift? Wolfe asked. Claire's hands tightened. I told you, it meant nothing. Nothing, Wolfe repeated. Then why was it removed from beneath the tree and later returned to accompany his body? Silence answered him. Not an empty silence. A crowded one, heavy with unspoken calculations. Wolfe leaned back slightly. Each of you has insisted that the gift is irrelevant. I do not accept that assessment. However, I will accept your insistence as testimony. For now. He glanced at me. Mr. Goodwin. I straightened. Every own here is uncomfortable, I said. That's expected. But some of you are uncomfortable in ways you recognize, and some of you aren't. That difference matters. That earned me a collection of looks. Irritation from Pike, defensiveness from Thomas, weary acknowledgement from Julia, careful neutrality from Claire, and something cold and appraising from Mrs. Eleanor Hollister. Wolfe rose slowly. "You will remain in this house until the police arrive," he said. "Until then, refrain from speculation. I will undertake that burden on your behalf." They dispersed gradually, reluctantly, like pieces returning to a board after a move no one had wanted to make. As they left, I watched hands tremble, eyes avoid, shoulders sag, and silences stretch just a little too long to be comfortable. Everyone in that room had a reason. What mattered now was whose reason had been strong enough to kill, and careful enough to let the gift do the talking. Chapter 4. What the gift contained. If there is one thing Nero Wolfe dislikes more than unanswered questions, it is unanswered questions wrapped in ribbon. By the time he announced that the gift would be opened, the Hollister townhouse had passed beyond shock and grief into something colder, quieter, and more deliberate. Shock is noisy. Grief can be theatrical. This was neither. This was the silence that arrives when people stop asking why and begin calculating how much damage, how much exposure, how much truth they can afford to survive. The police had been notified, eventually, reluctantly, but Wolfe had insisted on a delay long enough to examine what could still be examined without uniforms, notebooks, and procedural well-meaning trampling over intention. Sirens had not yet broken the winter air. For the moment, time belonged to us, and Wolfe treats time the way he treats orchids, with patience, control, and no tolerance for mishandling. The family had dispersed through the house, occupying rooms the way strangers do in waiting areas, close enough to feel the presence of others, far enough to avoid conversation. No one wanted to be alone. No one wanted to be observed. Grief rearranges instincts without permission, and fear finishes the job thoroughly. Marcus Hollister still lay at the foot of the stairs, now hidden behind more than a throw. The stairwell had become forbidden territory, guarded not by tape or law but by dread. No one passed it without averting their eyes. The package, the object that had vanished, returned, and made its accusation, had been moved. Carefully, Wolfe would not examine an object of consequence in a stairwell. He believes ideas deserve furniture. The library was chosen. It was a serious room, and it knew it. Dark wood shelves lined the walls, filled with books that had been read, consulted, disagreed with, and retained anyway. The desk was broad and scarred with honest use. Lamps cast steady, unromantic light. The air smelled faintly of leather, polish, and opinions formed long ago, and rarely revised. Wolfe settled into a chair with visible approval, as though the room itself had met his standards. He gestured for the others to enter. They did, reluctantly, forming a loose semicircle around the table, as if it were a witness stand rather than a piece of furniture. The gift sat in the center. Up close, stripped of ceremony, it looked almost severe. The green wrapping paper was expensive, but plain, chosen for discretion rather than delight. The ribbon was tied neatly, not artfully. This was not the work of someone seeking gratitude. It was the work of someone seeking invisibility. The tag bore Marcus's name in Mrs. Eleanor Hollister's careful, disciplined handwriting, and seeing it now felt intrusive, like overhearing a private sentence after its speaker was gone. Wolfe regarded the package for a long moment without touching it. He studied it the way a chess player studies a move that appears modest until its consequences begin unfolding. "Mr. Goodwin," he said. "Yes, sir. You will open the package." The reactions moved through the room in a small, uneven wave. Mrs. Eleanor Hollister stiffened, lips thinning as though he had suggested an indecency. Claire inhaled sharply, then steadied herself. Pike leaned forward, mouth opening in protest, before he realized he had no respectable ground on which to object. Thomas shifted in his chair, restless, fingers flexing as if preparing to argue or escape. Julia did none of those things. She went still, so still it was impossible not to notice. I noticed it, Wolfe noticed it, and Julia herself must have felt it because her breath caught for just a fraction of a second. I untied the ribbon slowly. It came loose without resistance, the bow retaining its shape as if insulted by necessity. The paper unfolded cleanly, revealing a plain wooden box beneath, dark, rectangular, unadorned. No carving, no initials, no attempt at charm or disguise. It was heavier than it looked. That alone told me it had never been meant to be empty. I set it on the table and glanced at Wolfe. He nodded once. The lid lifted easily. Inside was not velvet, lined nostalgia or a family heirloom polished for sentiment. Inside was a book, a ledger. It was small, bound in dark leather, worn smooth by handling rather than age. The corners were rounded from use, not neglect. It was wrapped in a piece of deep blue velvet, folded neatly around it like a protective skin. The ledger itself was secured with a thin brass clasp, and the clasp was locked. No title, no inscription, no visible indication of ownership. Just a book, carefully kept, deliberately concealed, and protected twice, once by velvet, once by metal. The room reacted in fragments. "That's it?" Pike said, his voice sharp with disappointment. "A book?" Thomas scoffed, relief and irritation tangling together as though he had been bracing for something worse. Claire frowned. "That doesn't make sense." Julia said nothing, her color drained with alarming speed. One hand tightened around the back of the chair beside her, knuckles whitening until the skin looked thin and strained. Her eyes fixed on the ledger with an intensity that had nothing to do with curiosity. It was recognition, or something dangerously close to it. Trying and failing to remain hidden, Wolfe saw it. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady on Julia's face. "Mrs. Eleanor Hollister," he said mildly, "you appear unwell." "I'm fine," Julia said quickly. Her voice was controlled. Her face was not. Wolfe did not pursue it. "Not yet." He turned his attention back to the object on the table, granting her a temporary reprieve. "A locked ledger," he said, "wrapped in velvet, gifted privately, removed from beneath a tree, and later returned to accompany a corpse." His eyes moved slowly around the room. Silence answered him. "I will rephrase," Wolfe said evenly. "Which of you has seen this ledger before?" "Nothing." "Which of you knows what it contains?" Still nothing. Wolfe nodded once, as though confirming a hypothesis rather than receiving information. "As expected, Mr. Goodwin," he said, "close the box." I did so carefully. The soft click of wood meeting wood sounded far louder than it should have, a period at the end of a sentence no one liked. Wolfe rested one broad hand lightly on the lid, not possessively, but deliberately, as though the object beneath required restraint. "This," he said, "was never intended to be opened in this room, nor, I suspect, in company." Thomas frowned. "Then why give it as a Christmas gift?" "Because," Wolfe replied, "Christmas provides camouflage. Gifts excuse secrecy. Wrapping disguises intent. Privacy is assumed, and questions are postponed." Pike snorted. "You're saying Marcus knew exactly what it was?" "Yes," Wolfe said, "and someone else did as well." His gaze shifted. Not directly, not accusingly, but enough to include Julia in its orbit, the way gravity includes a planet without naming it. She swallowed. "This ledger," Wolfe continued, "was not meant to delight. It was meant to confront." Mrs. Eleanor Hollister stiffened. "You're implying my son was being threatened." "I am implying," Wolfe said calmly, "that your son was being reminded." "Reminded of what?" Claire asked, her voice tight but controlled. "That," Wolfe said, "remains to be seen, but not yet." He withdrew his hand from the box. "The ledger will remain closed until the appropriate moment. Opening it now would produce noise, not clarity. And clarity, when it arrives, should arrive alone." I understood. Wolfe treats evidence the way other men treat explosives, with patience, respect, and a keen awareness of blast radius. Julia finally spoke, her voice thin and strained. Why would anyone put that beside him?" Wolfe looked at her steadily, not unkindly, but without concession. "Because they wanted the association to be unmistakable." The ledger did not kill Marcus Hollister, but it explains why he died. No one contradicted him. No one tried. Wolfe rose slowly. "You may all go," he said. "But understand this, the contents of that book bind at least one of you more tightly than blood, marriage, or money ever could." They left the room one by one quietly, carefully, like people exiting a courtroom before the verdict is read. No one looked at the table as they passed, except Claire, whose gaze lingered a fraction longer than necessary, as though measuring the distance between ignorance and inevitability. I stayed behind, watching Julia's back as she went. She did not look at the table again, which told me everything Wolfe had not yet said aloud. The gift had never been meant for the family. It had been meant for Marcus alone. And now that he was dead, it had become something far more dangerous. An accusation that could no longer be denied, only proven, and a promise that someone in that house would soon wish had remained wrapped forever. Chapter 5. The ledger's shadow, a locked book, has a way of casting a longer shadow than an open one. An open book can be argued with, disputed, even dismissed as a misunderstanding. A locked book just sits there, patient and accusing, letting imagination do the heavy lifting. By the time Nero Wolfe decided I should leave the Hollister townhouse, evening had settled over Manhattan with the kind of quiet determination that suggests the city knows something you don't. Snow flurries drifted lazily, undecided about whether they wanted to commit to the job. Streetlights came on early, reflecting off wet pavement and turning the sidewalks into narrow rivers of light. The police were finally in full possession of the stairwell, the body, and their own theories. Wolfe endured their questions with the practiced forbearance of a man humoring children who insist on rearranging his furniture. He answered what he had to, ignored what he could, and made it unmistakably clear that the ledger was not leaving the house until he said so. Surprisingly, they listened. Christmas. Staffing shortages encourage cooperation. A locked book that might explain a murder tends to inspire cooperation, even from men whose badges make them feel immortal. The ledger remained in the library, sealed and silent, watched more closely than Marcus Hollister ever had been while alive. Wolfe stood near the desk, hands folded over his stomach, his eyes unfocused in that way that usually means he is already several steps ahead of everyone else in the room. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, "you will now investigate the shadow cast by that object." I reached for my coat. "Any particular direction you'd like me to walk?" "Yes," Wolfe said, "toward the money." That narrowed things to a manageable universe. Marcus Hollister had built his reputation on transparency, civic virtue and generosity, photographed from flattering angles. The ledger suggested that at least one of those had been a costume. Men like Marcus don't keep secret books unless the truth costs more than silence, and unless silence has begun to feel unreliable. I left the townhouse with my notebook, finally out, and my collar turned up against the cold, and headed downtown toward Midtown, where accountants live when they are not pretending to be invisible. The name came easily. Wolfe supplied it without ceremony, as though reciting a grocery list. Edward Finlay, CPA, independent practice, long-standing professional relationship with Marcus Hollister, trusted. I have learned to distrust that word. Trusted usually means entangled, and sometimes terrified. Often both. Finlay's office occupied the 4th floor of a narrow building on West 47th Street, the kind that smells of old paper, toner, and ambitions that stalled somewhere around year 10. His name was etched neatly on the frosted glass door, the lettering precise and conservative, as though typography alone could enforce discretion. He answered the door himself. Edward Finlay was thin, pale, and prematurely grey, with eyes that had learned to look past people instead of at them. He wore a cardigan over his shirt and tie, the uniform of a man who works late and eats badly. His tie was loosened from habit, not rebellion. "Yes," he said. "My name is Archie Goodwin," I said. "I'd like to talk to you about Marcus Hollister." That was enough. His eyes flicked toward the hallway behind me, then back again. His shoulders sagged just slightly, like a man who had been holding himself upright, on borrowed tension. "I suppose you should come in," he said. The office was neat to the point of anxiety. Files were stacked, not piled. Desks were cleared, not bare. Every pen was aligned, every paper squared. Chaos frightened him more than guilt ever could. "You've heard," Finley said, gesturing me into a chair. "Yes," I said, "and so have you." He nodded once. "I was expecting someone eventually." "That's good," I said. "It means you're honest enough to be nervous." He did not smile. "I don't like easing into conversations like this. It wastes time and gives people room to build defenses." "Marcus Hollister kept a private ledger," I said, "locked, wrapped like a secret. I want to know what it recorded." Finley's hands tightened on the edge of his desk, the knuckles whitening before he consciously relaxed them. "I can't discuss client matters," he said automatically. "You can," I replied. "When your client is dead and the matters involve murder." That landed exactly where it needed to. Finley leaned back and stared at the ceiling, as though hoping it might offer advice. When it didn't, he exhaled slowly, the sound long and thin. "I told him not to keep records like that," he said. "That tells me you knew about them," I said. "Yes," he admitted. "I did." "What kind of records?" I asked. He stood, crossed the room, and looked out the window at the street below. Taxis slid past, like indifferent witnesses, their roofs streaked with slush and light. "Payments," he said finally. "Off-book, routed through charitable foundations, political committees, shell non-profits, clean on paper, filthy underneath." "Illegal?" I asked. "Falsified," he corrected quietly, "donations that never reached their destinations. Funds redirected through layers of paperwork, accounts created for one purpose and dissolved once they were emptied." "How long?" I asked. "Years," Finley said. "At least 5, possibly longer." That made the ledger more than incriminating. It made it explosive. "Why keep the ledger?" I asked. "Why not destroy it?" Finley turned back to me, his expression tired in a way sleep wouldn't fix. "Because Marcus was careful, and because he didn't trust anyone, not even himself." That fit too neatly to be coincidence. "Who knew?" I asked. "Very few," Finley said. "Marcus, me, and at least one person who was being paid to remain silent." That widened the field in directions I didn't like. "Did his wife know?" I asked. Finley hesitated, just long enough to make the answer unavoidable. "She suspected," he said. "She knew there were accounts she wasn't supposed to ask about. She didn't know details. Marcus made sure of that." Julia's reaction in the library rose in my mind again. Too sharp, too fast, too honest to be rehearsed. "Why give the ledger as a gift?" I asked. "Why now?" Finlay let out a short, humorless laugh. "Because Marcus was done waiting." "For what?" I asked. "For leverage to mature," Finley said. He reached the point where the risk of exposure was outweighed by the usefulness of the threat. I leaned back in my chair. "Meaning?" "Meaning Marcus planned to give the ledger away," Finley said. "Not out of generosity." "To whom?" I asked. "That I don't know," he said, "but I know why." "Tell me." "Christmas," Finley said. "Deadlines feel ceremonial when they're wrapped in tradition. Marcus liked symbolism. He liked moments that felt inevitable. He believed people behaved differently when faced with holidays." "So the gift wasn't kindness," I said. "No," Finley said flatly. "It was leverage, a warning, possibly an ultimatum. And whoever was on the receiving end decided not to wait," I said. Finley didn't argue. He simply nodded once, as if that conclusion had arrived long before I did. "Was Marcus afraid?" I asked. "Yes," Finley said after a moment, "but not enough. He believed control was permanent. He believed information made him untouchable. That belief kills more people than guns ever will." I stood and buttoned my coat. "You may want to consider legal counsel," I said. He nodded. "I already have." Outside, the city had gone fully dark, lit in that stubborn, glittering way New York uses to insist that nothing truly ends. It just changes hands. The wind cut through my coat, sharp and purposeful, and I welcomed it. It felt honest. He headed back uptown with Finley's words weighing down my pockets and the ledger's shadow stretching longer with every block. Marcus Hollister hadn't planned to be generous. He had planned to be dangerous. And Christmas, it turned out, wasn't about goodwill at all. It was his deadline. Chapter 6. The night before Christmas, if there was one thing Nero Wolfe trusted more than motive, it was sequence. People lie about feelings with astonishing ease. They lie about intentions with confidence, polish, and occasionally eloquence. But they lie poorly about time. Time resists decoration. It insists on order, and when that order fractures, even slightly, Wolfe notices. He notices the way other men notice a gunshot in a quiet room, instantly, instinctively, and without mercy. By the time I returned to the brownstone on West 35th Street, it was well past 11, and the city had slipped into that uneasy post, Christmas quiet peculiar to New York. It wasn't peaceful. It was alert. Shops were dark, but apartment windows glowed with trees and tinsel, staged cheerfully against the cold, as if cheer itself might be contagious. Snow lay thin and undecided on the sidewalks, just enough to look festive without committing to inconvenience. The city was waiting for routine to return, and it didn't care for the delay. Wolfe was already in the office. He sat behind his desk, immense and immovable, a cold beer within reach, his eyes half-lidded in that familiar way that meant his mind was working harder than the rest of him. The lamps cast steady, civilized light. Upstairs, Theodore was tending the orchids with religious devotion, oblivious to homicide, scandal, and seasonal goodwill. Everything was in order, which meant Wolfe had room to think, and Wolfe does his best thinking when the world behaves. He did not look up when I entered. "You are late," he said. "I was thorough," I replied, shrugging out of my coat. "Finlay sings, but only in minor keys." Wolfe grunted. "Report." I did. The falsified donations. The shell charities that existed just long enough to be useful and then vanished politely. The off-book payments routed through respectable names and emptied before anyone noticed. The ledger as leverage, not confession, not conscience. When I finished, Wolfe opened his eyes fully and stared at the ceiling, as though the answers might be written there in large, accommodating letters for those who knew how to read them. "So," he said at last, "Marcus Hollister intended to weaponize his own transgressions." "Christmas delivery," I said, "wrapped, tagged, and timed." "Yes," Wolfe agreed, "but misdelivered." That was the hinge. I felt it click even before he elaborated, the way a door settles into a lock you didn't realize had been turned. Wolfe gestured for me to sit and folded his hands over his stomach, the posture he adopts when he is about to dismantle a situation carefully, methodically, and without mercy. "Let us reconstruct the night," he said. "Not the murder, the night preceding it." I settled into my chair. Interrupting Wolfe during a reconstruction is a mistake you only make once. According to statements. Wolfe continued. The Hollister household retired shortly after midnight. Mrs. Eleanor Hollister withdrew first, then Claire Keene. Mr. Pike departed shortly, before 12:30. Mr. Thomas Hollister claims he went to bed immediately thereafter. Marcus Hollister remained awake. "So far," I said. "Everyone agrees on that." "Agreement," Wolfe said, "is not corroboration, it is coincidence." He continued. The Christmas tree stood intact. The gifts were arranged. The ledger was beneath the tree, wrapped, tagged, and, at that time, unremarkable. "So far," I said, "no one admits to touching it." "Which is irrelevant," Wolfe replied. "Admissions are not evidence. What matters is that at some point after midnight, the package vanished. At that time, Marcus Hollister was alive." I nodded. "Phone records put him awake until nearly 1 a.m. Email drafts too. He was working planning." "Precisely," Wolfe said. "Therefore, the removal of the gift was not incidental to the murder. It preceded it." "And whoever took it," I said, "didn't panic." "No," Wolfe said. "They acted deliberately. Panic destroys order." This act required time, time alone, time unobserved, time to think. He leaned back slightly, the chair protesting faintly. The ledger was not taken to destroy it. No, I agreed. Too dangerous, too useful. Indeed, Wolfe said, it was taken to be examined. That mattered more than anything else. Which means, I said slowly, whoever intercepted the gift either knew what it was, or suspected strongly enough to risk confirmation. Yes, Wolfe said, which reduces our field considerably. He raised a thick finger. First, the individual had access to the tree after midnight without attracting attention. Second, the individual had privacy sufficient to open the package, examine the contents, and understand their significance. Third, the individual had motive to prevent the ledger from reaching its intended recipient. And fourth, I added, the individual needed to put it back. Wolfe's eyes shifted to me. Explain. The gift reappeared, I said. Placed beside the body. That wasn't necessary, unless the ledger had to remain in the house. If the goal had been silence, the ledger would have vanished permanently. Correct, Wolfe said. Returning it transformed the ledger from evidence into symbol, a declaration rather than a confession. And symbols don't talk, I said. Unless compelled, Wolfe replied. He rose and moved to the window, peering down at the street where a taxi idled beneath a wreath hung from a lamppost. From that height, the city looked orderly, almost benign. Wolfe knows better. Marcus Hollister planned to confront someone on Christmas morning, Wolfe said. He believed the threat of exposure would produce compliance. Instead, I said, it produced fear. Yes, Wolfe said. Fear demands confirmation. Confirmation requires access. That access occurred after midnight. He turned back to me. Which means the killer knew of the ledger before Marcus was killed. That narrowed the field sharply. Julia, I said carefully. Wolfe did not answer at once. When he did, his voice was precise and unsentimental. Julia Hollister suspected irregularities. She did not know specifics. Her reaction in the library was recognition without comprehension. She was startled, not prepared. Claire? I asked. Claire Keene's interest lingered. But curiosity is insufficient. Nor does she possess the necessary insulation or authority. Thomas? I offered. Debt, Wolfe acknowledged. But Thomas Hollister lacks discipline. Debt produces desperation, not strategy. This required patience. I exhaled slowly, which leaves Pike. Wolfe's mouth curved slightly. Leonard Pike possessed motive, access, professional literacy, and sufficient arrogance to believe himself indispensable. He would understand the ledger's implications immediately. And he'd have reason to intercept it, I said, before it reached someone else. Or before it reached him, Wolfe corrected. Marcus may have intended the ledger for Pike, or for someone whose leverage over Pike exceeded Marcus's own. I frowned. Either way, interception was essential. Yes, Wolfe said, and once Pike understood the contents, he required time. Time to calculate, I said. To weigh exposure against action, and control of the ledger, Wolfe said. Control of the narrative. He returned to his chair. Thus the sequence. Gift removed after midnight. Ledger examined, consequences assessed, Marcus confronted, or eliminated, and the ledger returned to establish causation. And the murder, I said, wasn't spontaneous. No, Wolfe said. It was scheduled. Christmas, I said quietly. Yes, Wolfe agreed. Deadlines become heavier when tradition lends them weight. People behave recklessly when calendars insist on finality. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling. So Christmas night is when everything broke. Wolfe lifted his beer, considered it, and set it down untouched. The night after Christmas Day, he said, is when secrets decide whether they will survive the morning. I stood and stretched. Tomorrow. Wolfe's eyes sharpened. Tomorrow, Mr. Goodwin, we will compel the ledger to speak. And the killer? I asked. Wolfe's expression hardened, just enough to be unmistakable. The killer has already spoken. He simply does not yet realize how loudly or how permanently. Outside, a distant siren rose and faded, swallowed by the city's seasonal restraint. Somewhere, a church bell rang early for midnight mass, the sound drifting through the cold air like a reminder no one had asked for. The night after Christmas Day, it turned out someone had worked very hard to make sure the morning arrived under entirely different terms, and that when truth finally spoke, it would not whisper. Chapter 7. The Widow's Alibi. Alibis come in two varieties, the kind that collapse when you touch them, and the kind that sit quietly, daring you to understand them. Julia Hollister's belonged to the second kind. Wolfe heard it the morning after Christmas with the same patient attention he gives to a menu read aloud by someone who intends to order everything incorrectly. He did not interrupt. He did not challenge her phrasing or her emphasis. He did not ask questions when they might have sounded like accusations. He accepted her account calmly, courteously, and, most damning of all, completely, which is how I knew it was finished. We were back in the Hollister drawing room, a space that now felt overused by truth. The curtains were half-drawn against a pale winter light that refused to warm anything it touched. The Christmas tree still stood in the corner, undecorated now, its lights unplugged, its presence reduced to obligation rather than celebration. Needles littered the carpet beneath it, unnoticed and uncollected. The house itself looked tired, like a witness who had stayed on the stand too long. The police had been and gone again, collecting statements that sounded complete until you listened closely. They had taken notes, exchanged glances, and left behind the faint but unmistakable sense that something essential had escaped them. Wolfe had waited them out with professional patience. He always does. Authority rarely appreciates being hurried, and Wolfe understands that better than most. Julia sat where she had sat before, near the window. The light caught her face in a way that was almost kind, smoothing edges that grief had sharpened. She looked smaller than she had 2 days earlier. Not weaker, exactly, but compressed, as though vigilance and sorrow had agreed to share the same narrow space. She was impeccably dressed, as always, but the care felt automatic now, performed out of habit rather than intention. Her hands rested folded in her lap, fingers interlaced too tightly. Wolfe regarded her over steepled fingers. "You have stated," he said, "that you retired shortly after midnight on Christmas night." "Yes," Julia said. Her voice was steady, practiced. "I took my medication and went to sleep." "And slept," Wolfe prompted. "Until morning," she said. "Until Claire woke me." Wolfe inclined his head slightly. "You take medication regularly?" "Yes, for sleep." "And anxiety," she added after a moment. "The holidays are difficult. No one challenged that. Christmas has a way of magnifying fractures. People spend the rest of the year ignoring." "What medication?" Wolfe asked. Julia named it without hesitation. She gave the dosage as well, cleanly and confidently. That part had been rehearsed carefully, perhaps even truthfully. "And the effect?" Wolfe asked. "It makes me drowsy," she said. "It keeps me asleep, completely." Wolfe asked. Julia hesitated. Just a fraction of a second, but long enough for Wolfe to notice and catalogue. "Usually," she said. Wolfe nodded, as though satisfied. "You did not leave your room during the night." "Number, you did not hear anything unusual." "Number, you did not observe anyone else awake." "Number," she met his gaze squarely. If there was guilt there, it was buried beneath discipline and exhaustion. Julia Hollister had spent years learning which truths to acknowledge and which to survive. Wolfe folded his hands over his stomach. "Very well." The room exhaled. Even Julia seemed to relax slightly, as though a heavy door had finally closed and locked behind her. It hadn't. "Mr. Goodwin," Wolfe said. I stood. "Yes, sir. You examined Mrs. Eleanor Hollister's medication last evening." I did not look at Julia when I answered. "Yes, please describe what you found," Wolfe said. I took a breath. This was the part people never enjoy, because numbers don't argue and facts don't negotiate. "The prescription bottle contained fewer pills than it should have," I said. "Given the dosage instructions and the refill date, there were 4 pills missing." Julia stiffened visibly this time. the composure cracking just enough to show what it had been holding back. Her fingers tightened in her lap, knuckles paling. Wolfe raised a hand, gently. "Mrs. Eleanor Hollister," he said mildly, "you told both the police and myself that you took one pill that night." "Yes," she said quickly. "That's correct. One pill," Wolfe repeated. "And yet 4 are missing." Silence settled into the room, not abruptly, but deliberately, as if it had been invited and shown where to sit. Even the house seemed to listen. Julia's gaze flicked toward the window, then back again. Sometimes I take more than one, if I can't sleep." "On this night?" Wolfe asked. She hesitated again, longer this time, searching for memory or permission. "I don't remember." "That," Wolfe said gently, "is improbable." Her chin lifted, defensiveness replacing fatigue. "Are you accusing me of killing my husband?" "No," Wolfe said calmly. "I am excluding you." That startled her more than an accusation would have. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. "You did not steal the gift," Wolfe continued. "Nor did you strike Marcus Hollister, but you did not sleep uninterrupted through the night." Julia's hands tightened in her lap, fingers pressing into fabric as though anchoring herself. "You awoke," Wolfe said, "sometime after midnight. You were aware, consciously or not, that someone else in the house was awake." "No," she said, too quickly, the denial automatic. Wolfe shook his head. "Not immediately. You did not see the package removed, but you became aware later, after it was returned." Her eyes widened, despite herself, the reaction sharp and involuntary. "You recognized it in the library," Wolfe said, "not merely as an object, but as a problem you had hoped was already resolved." Julia closed her eyes. "I did not take it," she said. "I swear that." "I believe you," Wolfe said. "That did what accusation could not. It broke her composure completely." She demanded, her voice rising, brittle now. "What is it you think I owe you?" "The truth," Wolfe said evenly. "Not about the act, about the knowledge." She laughed once, sharply, without humor. "Knowledge," she said. "That's a dangerous word in this house." "Yes," Wolfe agreed. "It has already proved fatal." The silence that followed was longer, heavier, filled with the weight of things not yet said. Finally, Julia spoke again, her voice quieter now. "Marcus told me. He told me someone would try to stop him." Wolfe's eyes sharpened. "When?" "The night before," she said, "before we went to bed." "What exactly did he say?" Wolfe asked. "That Christmas would force a decision," Julia said slowly. "That he was tired of waiting, that leverage only works if you're willing to use it." I watched her hands as she spoke. They were steady now, resigned rather than tense. "Did he name the person?" Wolfe asked. "No," Julia said, "but I knew." Wolfe did not ask how. He already knew the answer. "When you realized pills were missing," Wolfe said, "you understood that someone else had been awake." "Yes," Julia whispered. "And when you later saw the ledger returned," Wolfe continued, "you knew that confrontation had already occurred." "Yes, and you said nothing," Wolfe said. Julia looked at him directly now, "because I believed Marcus could still fix it, that he always did." Wolfe shook his head slowly. "Silence," he said, "is not neutrality, it is assistance." Her breath caught, the sound sharp and final in the quiet room. "You did not cause your husband's death," Wolfe said, "but your silence allowed it." Julia nodded once, a small, defeated motion. "I know." Wolfe rose. The conversation finished as decisively as a verdict. "You will testify to this," he said. Fully, she did not argue. The fight had gone out of her, replaced by something heavier and more permanent. As we left the room, I glanced back once. Julia sat very still, staring at the window, at the faint reflection of a Christmas tree that no longer pretended to be cheerful. Outside, the city moved on with its usual indifference, horns blaring, people complaining about the cold, life insisting on itself. Inside, Wolfe had done what he always does best. He had taken an alibi that looked solid and shown exactly where it bent, and who had paid the price for that bend. Marcus Hollister had trusted silence. It had not returned the favor. Chapter 8, The Brothers Panic. There is a particular sound a man makes when his courage gives way. It is not loud, it is not dramatic. It is not even particularly noticeable unless you are listening for it. It is the quiet internal click of something snapping into a new position, usually followed by too many words, too much motion, and not nearly enough control. Thomas Hollister made that sound somewhere between my third question and his second cigarette. I found him in the garage, which felt appropriate. Garages are where families put what they don't want to acknowledge every day. Cars they can't quite afford, tools they don't quite know how to use, and secrets they don't trust inside the house. The Hollister garage was detached, immaculate, and faintly cold, the kind of place that smelled of oil, rubber, and money spent to avoid mess rather than to solve it. A single fluorescent bulb buzzed overhead, giving everything a pale, unforgiving cast. Thomas stood near the workbench, hands shoved deep into the pockets of a jacket that was too thin for December, shoulders hunched as if the ceiling were pressing down. He looked like a man waiting to be arrested by fate and trying not to notice. "Got a minute?" I asked. He jumped, actually jumped, and turned so fast he nearly knocked over a neatly arranged set of wrenches. "Sure," he said too quickly. "Yeah, sure." I closed the door behind me and leaned against it. I didn't rush him. Thomas Hollister rushed himself just fine. "You've been having a rough holiday," I said conversationally. He laughed once, sharp and brittle. "That's one way to put it." "Another way," I said, "is that your brother was about to blow up your life." That landed. His eyes snapped to mine, then away again. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you do," I said. "You just don't want to hear it said out loud." He swallowed, Adam's apple bobbing like it wanted to escape. I pushed gently. Marcus kept a ledger. Thomas stiffened, not subtly. His entire posture changed, like I'd pressed on a bruise he'd been carefully avoiding. "Everyone keeps records," he said. "Not like this," I replied. "This one names." He didn't answer. "Yours," I added. That did it. Thomas turned away, paced once, then stopped short, as if the floor had ended unexpectedly. His hands came out of his pockets and clenched at his sides, fingers curling until the knuckles stood out white against his skin. "I didn't kill him," he said suddenly. "I didn't ask," I replied. "But you think—" He stopped, shook his head violently. "I didn't kill him." "I know," I said. "So does Wolfe." That confused him more than suspicion would have. "Then why are you here?" he demanded, voice cracking. "Because you stole the gift," I said. The silence that followed wasn't denial. It was calculation, fast, frantic, and already failing. "I didn't mean to," he said finally. "That's a new defense," I said. "Try again." He sagged against the workbench, the fight draining out of him all at once. He suddenly looked older, smaller, less like Marcus's younger brother, and more like someone who had spent years borrowing confidence he never owned. "I saw it under the tree," he said. "I saw the tag, my mother's handwriting. I knew," he swallowed. "I knew he wouldn't give me anything like that. Not anymore. So you opened it," I said. "No," he said quickly. I didn't open it. I just felt it. It was heavy. I knew it wasn't a watch or something sentimental. "When?" I asked. "After midnight," he said. "Everyone was asleep. I couldn't sleep anyway." "Why?" I asked. He laughed again, this time without humor, "Because I owed money to people who don't wait politely." That fit neatly into the picture. I thought. He stopped, rubbed his face hard with both hands. I thought it might be something about the business, or about me, Marcus. Had that look earlier, like he'd already decided something and was just waiting for the right moment to drop it. "So you took it," I said. "Yes," he admitted. I panicked. I didn't know what else to do. "Where did you take it?" I asked. "Out here," he said, gesturing vaguely. "I hid it in the trunk of my car under the spare tire." "Planning to destroy it?" I said. "Latter," he said quickly. Not that night. I needed time to think, to figure out how bad it was. Did you open it? I asked. No, he said. I swear, I didn't have a key, and I was too scared to break it. That rang true. Thomas Hollister didn't break things. He avoided consequences until they cornered him. When did you put it back? I asked. His eyes flicked toward the house. After. After what? I pressed. After I saw Marcus, he said quietly. That was the moment the air changed. When? I asked. Early, he said, before dawn. I went back inside. I needed to talk to him, to beg him if I had to. And, I said, he was alive, Thomas said firmly, as if daring me to contradict him. He was angry, furious, but alive. What did he say? I asked. That he was finished protecting me, Thomas said. That Christmas was his deadline, that I'd had years to clean up my mess. And you believed him, I said. Yes, he said hoarsely. That's why I put the ledger back, I thought. If it stayed, maybe he wouldn't do it. Maybe he'd cool off. I nodded slowly. Panic makes people believe in delay, the way drowning men believe in air. You didn't kill him, I said again. No, Thomas said desperately. I swear. I left him standing at the stairs alive. I went back to bed and didn't sleep a minute. I believed him. More importantly, Wolfe would believe him, not because of sympathy, but because the timeline demanded it. Thomas's fear was sloppy, loud, and fundamentally selfish. Murder of this sort requires something else. I left the garage with Thomas slumped over the workbench, his head in his hands, the weight of his own cowardice, finally landing where it belonged. Back inside, the house felt different now, not calmer, but more defined, like a puzzle after the last corner piece clicks into place. I found Wolfe waiting in the library, hands folded, eyes already expectant. He took the gift, I said. After midnight, hid it in the garage, never opened it, put it back before dawn. And Marcus? Wolfe asked. Alive, I said. Angry. Clear. Standing at the stairs. Wolfe nodded once. Then Thomas Hollister is guilty only of panic, which, I said, nearly killed him anyway. Yes, Wolfe agreed, but not his brother. That left one name standing in the room like an unpaid bill. And for the first time since Christmas morning, the shape of the truth stopped shifting. It had found its edges and Wolfe, I knew, was already sharpening them. Chapter 9. The partner's visit, if there is one luxury Nero Wolfe never indulges. It is surprise. Surprise implies disorder, and disorder offends him. By the time he announced that Leonard Pike would be joining us that afternoon, Wolfe had already accounted for the man's arrival, his objections, his denials, and most importantly, the precise point at which his composure would fail. Wolfe does not summon people to learn what they will say. He summons them to confirm what he already knows. Pike arrived shortly after 3. He entered the brownstone with the air of a man who believes inconvenience is something that happens to other people. His coat was expensive, his expression professionally neutral, his confidence practiced and well maintained. He greeted me with a nod that acknowledged my existence without granting it importance, then turned his attention to Wolfe with a polite smile that did not reach his eyes. You wanted to see me, Pike said. Wolfe regarded him without warmth. I required your presence. Pike took the chair I indicated, settling into it as though it were a boardroom seat rather than a witness's perch. He crossed one leg over the other, hands folded loosely, relaxed, too relaxed. You've spoken with the police, Pike said. I assume this is a formality. No, Wolfe said. It is a reconstruction. That drew the first flicker of irritation. Wolfe leaned back, fingers steepled. You left the Hollister residence shortly before 12:30 on Christmas night. Yes, Pike said easily. I had another engagement. Indeed, Wolfe said. And yet you returned. Pike blinked. Once. Returned. Yes, Wolfe said, at approximately 5:30 in the morning. The silence that followed was brief, but instructive. That's ridiculous, Pike said. I was home. Alone, Wolfe said. Pike's jaw tightened. Do you have proof? Yes, Wolfe said. But that is not yet relevant. He continued calmly. Marcus Hollister intended to give away a ledger on Christmas morning. Pike shifted in his chair. I've heard about this ledger, everyone has. Not before Marcus's death, Wolfe replied. Only those with reason to fear it. Pike laughed softly. Are you suggesting I was afraid of my own partner's bookkeeping? No, Wolfe said. I am stating that you recognized it immediately for what it was. Leverage. Pike's smile thinned. Marcus was unstable. He liked theatrics. He liked deadlines, Wolfe corrected. Christmas was his. Wolfe leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering. You arrived at the Hollister residence before dawn because Thomas Hollister's panic altered your schedule. Pike stiffened. I don't know what you're talking about. Thomas removed the gift after midnight, Wolfe said. You discovered this before morning. That's absurd, Pike said. Your phone records suggest otherwise. Wolfe replied. A call placed at 4:47 a.m. to Marcus Hollister, unanswered. Pike opened his mouth, then closed it. You drove to the Hollister residence, Wolfe continued, relentless now. You entered without difficulty. You confronted Marcus in the stairwell. I didn't. You argued, Wolfe said. Not about money, about control. Marcus intended to hand the ledger to someone else. Perhaps an attorney, perhaps a regulator. In any case, not you. Pike's composure began to fray, threads showing beneath the polish. He was threatening to destroy everything. Pike snapped. Years of work. Yes, Wolfe said, including yours. Silence pressed in. You demanded the ledger, Wolfe said. Marcus refused. He believed his position was unassailable. He was wrong, Pike said bitterly. Indeed, Wolfe said. The argument escalated. It moved toward the stairs. I watched Pike's hands. They had tightened around the arms of the chair. You struck him, Wolfe said. Once, in anger, he fell. No, Pike said hoarsely. Yes, Wolfe replied. You did not intend to kill him. You intended to silence him. Pike swallowed. I didn't know he'd die. Intent is immaterial, Wolfe said. Sequence is not. Wolfe leaned back. Afterward, you located the gift. You took it, not to conceal it, but to control its meaning. Pike looked up sharply. You returned it, Wolfe said, placing it beside the body. You staged the scene so the ledger would explain the murder without revealing its reader. That's not. You needed the ledger to remain, Wolfe said. You needed it to appear untouched, a symbol, not evidence. Pike's shoulders sagged. I couldn't let it leave the house, Pike said quietly. If it went public, you would be finished, Wolfe said. Pike nodded once. Marcus forced my hand. No, Wolfe said. You forced it yourself. The room was very quiet. You came unannounced before dawn, Wolfe concluded. You confronted Marcus Hollister. You killed him in the course of that confrontation, and then you arranged the scene to implicate motive rather than method. Pike closed his eyes. I didn't plan it, he said. No one ever does, Wolfe replied. I moved toward the door. The police will be notified, Wolfe said calmly. You may wish to remain seated. Pike did not protest. As I reached for the handle, Wolfe spoke once more. Christmas, he said, is an inconvenient time for ultimatums. Outside, the city continued its business, oblivious. Inside, the last uncertainty had finally settled into place. The truth, at last, had stopped shifting. Chapter 10. Why the gift returned. Nero Wolfe does not enjoy explanations, he tolerates them. An explanation, to Wolfe, is not a performance or a courtesy. It is a necessary cleanup operation, like restoring furniture after an unpleasant visitor has left muddy footprints. When he finally agrees to explain something, it is because the explanation will eliminate disorder, not because anyone deserves it. The office gathering took place at 4 o'clock. Wolfe insists on punctuality for 3 reasons. respect, efficiency, and dominance. In that order, everyone was present when he entered the office and settled behind his desk with the air of a monarch, resuming a throne, temporarily vacated for reasons he found tiresome. Julia Hollister sat stiffly on the red leather chair to Wolfe's right, composed but hollowed out. Thomas Hollister occupied the chair beside her, pale and exhausted, fear having finally burned itself down to ash. Claire Keene sat straight-backed, attentive, her expression guarded but resolute. Two detectives stood near the back wall, notebooks ready, faces carefully neutral. Leonard Pike was absent, which was exactly where Wolfe wanted him, already separated from the room, already irrelevant to its geometry. I stood at Wolfe's left, notebook closed. When Wolfe begins, interruptions are a form of self-harm. Wolfe folded his hands over his stomach. "We are here," he began, "to dispose of a single remaining confusion, not who killed Marcus Hollister. That question has been answered, nor why. That has also been addressed. What remains is why the gift returned." He paused, letting the phrase hang in the air. "A missing object," Wolfe continued, "provokes inquiry. A returned object communicates intent. This distinction is crucial." No one spoke. The ledger beneath the Christmas tree was not a sentimental gift. It was an instrument. Marcus Hollister intended to use it as leverage on Christmas morning, because deadlines become heavier when tradition lends them weight. Thomas flinched. Julia did not. "The ledger vanished after midnight," Wolfe said. "That act was panic. Thomas Hollister feared exposure and removed it impulsively. He neither opened it nor understood its full significance. He hid it. This act, while culpable in its own way, did not result in murder." Thomas swallowed but nodded. "The ledger then returned," Wolfe said, "and this is where intention replaced panic." Wolfe's eyes moved to the detectives. "Leonard Pike arrived at the Hollister residence before dawn," Wolfe said, "unannounced, uninvited, alarmed." Claire drew in a quiet breath. "He confronted Marcus Hollister," Wolfe continued. "Not about money, but about control. Marcus intended to hand the ledger to someone else, summoning beyond Pike's influence. The confrontation escalated. It moved to the stairwell. Pike struck Marcus Hollister. The fall killed him." Julia closed her eyes. "That," Wolfe said, "explains the death. It does not yet explain the gift." He leaned back slightly. After the killing, Pike discovered the ledger had already been returned to the house. He understood its significance immediately. A missing ledger would prompt a search. A missing ledger would invite questions about who had last handled it, who had motive to remove it, and where it had gone. Wolfe's voice hardened. But a returned ledger, placed carefully beside the body, does something else entirely. He raised a finger. "It tells a story." I could see it land. "A missing gift is a mystery," Wolfe said. "A returned gift is a message. Pike wanted the police, and me, to read that message. He wanted us to assume symbolism instead of strategy." One of the detectives frowned. "Symbolism?" "Yes," Wolfe said impatiently. "Greed, threats, financial corruption. An abstract motive, untethered to a precise sequence of events. The ledger beside the body suggests cause, not timing." Wolfe leaned forward. By returning the gift, Pike attempted to redirect attention away from when events occurred and toward what they meant. He wanted investigators to study the ledger, not the clock. Silence filled the room again, thick and final. "He wrapped a lie in ribbon," Wolfe said. "A clumsy lie, one that assumed intellect would be distracted by drama." Wolfe's gaze moved, deliberately, from Julia to Thomas to Claire. "The ledger did not kill Marcus Hollister, nor did it demand his death. What killed him was a man who mistook leverage for immunity." Wolfe straightened. "Leonard Pike returned the gift because he needed the ledger to explain the murder, without explaining himself. He wanted it present but inert, seen but unread, a symbol rather than a weapon." I spoke then, because Wolfe was finished. And he underestimated Wolfe. Wolfe did not correct me. The detectives closed their notebooks. One of them nodded once, sharply, already thinking ahead to paperwork and warrants, and the long satisfaction of sequence restored. Julia Hollister rose slowly. Marcus believed he could control people with knowledge, she said quietly. Yes, Wolfe said. He was mistaken. She nodded, accepting that without argument, Thomas did not speak. He did not need to. His role in the story had been reduced to what it had always been, fear without force. When the room emptied, Wolfe remained seated, expression unreadable. I waited. Finally, he spoke. The return of the gift, Wolfe said, was not clever. It was theatrical. And theatrics are the refuge of men who lack patience. He reached for his bell. Mr. Goodwin, he said, I find this entire affair distasteful. Order luncheon. I smiled. Anything festive? I asked. No, Wolfe said firmly. Christmas has already done enough damage. I rang for Fritz. Outside, New York moved on, indifferent and relentless, as it always does. Inside, the mystery was complete. The ribbon had been untied, and the lie, once exposed, lay exactly where it belonged, beneath the tree, with nothing left to conceal. Chapter 11. The final unwrapping. There are moments when the truth does not arrive suddenly. It arrives tired. By the time Leonard Pike was brought into Nero Wolfe's office, the truth had already been awake too long. It had been handled, weighed, examined from angles Pike had never anticipated, and stripped of every place it might have hidden comfortably. What remained was not drama, not revelation, but inevitability, the kind that makes resistance feel foolish rather than brave. The office was prepared. Wolfe insists on preparation, not because it impresses people, but because it deprives them of excuses. The chairs were arranged with deliberate symmetry, each one positioned so that no occupant could avoid seeing the desk. The windows were closed against the cold, muting the city to a distant, manageable hum. The desk itself was clear, except for one object, placed precisely where Wolfe wanted every eye to land. The ledger. It lay open now, no longer wrapped, no longer locked, its pages exposed with quiet confidence. The brass clasp rested uselessly against the leather cover, its authority revoked. Wolfe had chosen the page with care, the way a man chooses the final word in an argument he has already won. Inked columns marched neatly across the paper, orderly and merciless, refusing to soften what they recorded. Christmas decorations lingered stubbornly in the brownstone, a wreath still hung on the door. Evergreen boughs decorated the banister, and a small arrangement of holly sat on the side table in the hall. They looked out of place now, decorations left up too long after the reason for them had died. Christmas forgives many things: greed, excess, hypocrisy, but it does not forgive blood. Not when it's spilled deliberately, and not when it's cleaned up clumsily. Pike entered the office and stopped just inside the doorway. For the first time since I had met him, his confidence did not precede him. His coat was immaculate, his shoes polished, but his posture was not. His shoulders were tight, his eyes wary, his mouth set in a line that suggested effort rather than resolve. He looked like a man who had been awake for days, rehearsing defenses that no longer believed in themselves. "Sit down, Mr. Pike," Wolfe said. Pike obeyed. He chose the chair directly opposite Wolfe, as if positioning might still matter, as if geometry itself could offer protection. The detective stood near the back wall, notebooks closed, but ready. Julia Hollister sat stiffly to Wolfe's right, composed but hollowed out, grief refined into something hard and brittle. Thomas Hollister occupied a chair beside her, pale and rigid, his eyes fixed on the carpet as if it might open and take him with it. Claire Keene sat opposite, straight, backed, attentive, her expression professional and unreadable. Wolfe did not speak at once. He allowed the silence to stretch, to settle into the room like furniture. Silence makes people honest faster than shouting ever does. Pike shifted once, then stilled, as though movement itself might be a confession. "Mr. Pike," Wolfe said at last, "you are a man who values control." Pike's jaw tightened. "I value responsibility." "No," Wolfe said calmly, You value management of outcomes, of people, of narratives. Responsibility would have required restraint, and restraint is something you abandoned before dawn on Christmas Day. Pike said nothing. His gaze flicked briefly to the detectives, then back to Wolfe. Wolfe placed one broad finger on the open ledger. This book undermined that belief. Pike's eyes betrayed him, drawn to the page despite himself, then pulled away again as though the numbers might speak his name aloud. You recognized its danger instantly, Wolfe continued, not merely because it implicated you, which it does, but because it removed your ability to shape events gradually. Marcus Hollister forced immediacy upon you. He replaced negotiation with finality. Pike exhaled sharply. Marcus was reckless. Yes, Wolfe agreed, and you were furious. Wolfe inclined his head toward me. I stood and read, not the whole ledger, not even most of it. Just enough. Dates, amounts, foundations with noble names and noble letterhead, transfers routed through Pike's authority, approvals bearing his signature, funds redirected, disguised, and laundered through respectability. It was clean. It was methodical. It was devastating precisely because it was boring. Crime at this level thrives on monotony. I read slowly, without emphasis. The ledger required none. When I finished, Pike's head had bowed slightly, as though gravity itself had increased. And then, Wolfe said, "There is testimony." He gestured to Thomas. Thomas lifted his head reluctantly. His voice shook at first, then steadied as truth often does. Once it has decided to emerge, he spoke of the gift beneath the tree, the panic, the theft, the hiding place in the trunk of his car, the early morning confrontation with Marcus while he was still alive. Angry, upright, unmistakably breathing, and very much himself. I left him at the stairs, Thomas said. Alive, I swear that. Wolfe nodded once, neither encouraging nor condemning. Julia spoke next. Her voice was quiet, controlled, but it carried the weight of long practice and longer endurance. She told them what Marcus had said the night before Christmas, the deadline, the certainty, the warning that someone would try to stop him, and finally, her silence. Why she had said nothing when she realized someone else had been awake, when she saw the ledger returned. I believed he could still fix it, she said simply. He always had before. I believed knowledge protected him. Wolfe did not comment. He did not need to. Her statement required no correction, only acknowledgement. When Julia finished, the room felt smaller, tighter, as though the truth had taken up more space than before. Even the Christmas greenery seemed to droop under it. Needles darkening on the carpet like punctuation at the end of a sentence. No one wanted to read. Wolfe turned his attention back to Pike. You arrived before dawn, Wolfe said, unannounced, alarmed. You confronted Marcus Hollister in the stairwell. Pike shook his head once weakly. He backed me into a corner. No, Wolfe said. You walked into one. You mistook leverage for immunity, familiarity for safety, and habit for permanence. Pike's composure finally failed. Not with drama, not with protest, but with collapse. His shoulders sagged. His hands slid from the arms of the chair and rested uselessly in his lap. I built everything, he said hoarsely. Years of work, he would have destroyed it. Yes, Wolfe said, and you destroyed it yourself. Marcus merely set a date. Pike swallowed hard. I lost control, just for a moment. That, Wolfe said, is all murder ever requires. The detective stepped forward then, the moment unmistakable. As they took Pike by the arms, he did not resist. He looked once more at the ledger on Wolfe's desk, at the exposed page that had ended him more thoroughly than the stairs ever could. I thought I could fix it, Pike said quietly. I thought if I put it back, if I made it look like meaning instead of timing, you believed. Wolfe interrupted. That symbolism would distract reason. It rarely does. Pike did not argue. They led him out. When the door closed behind them, the room did not relax so much as it settled. Completion has a different sound than relief. It is quieter, heavier, and more permanent. Julia rose slowly. Marcus believed knowledge made him safe, she said. Yes, Wolfe replied. It made him dangerous. Thomas exhaled shakily, the sound of a man who had survived something he did not deserve to. Claire Keene stood, nodded once to Wolfe, and left without ceremony, already stepping back into a world that would continue without Marcus Hollister and without sentiment. When the room was empty at last, Wolfe remained seated, looking at the ledger one final time. He did not touch it. He rarely touches finished things. Christmas, he said almost to himself, is an inconvenient season for lies. I smiled faintly. But a good one for endings. Yes, Wolfe said. Truth, like a gift, resists permanent wrapping. He closed the ledger with a soft, definitive sound, final as a judge's gavel. Outside, New York continued, as it always does, indifferent, relentless, alive. Inside, the final unwrapping was complete. Nothing remained hidden. Nothing remained undone. Chapter 12. Christmas, without illusions, the Hollister house emptied the way all houses do after the truth has finished using them. Quietly, methodically. Without apology, there is a particular stillness that follows the end of a crime, not peace, exactly, but exhaustion. The rooms no longer lean forward, listening. The walls stop holding their breath. Furniture resumes the innocent posture of objects that insist they were never involved. A house that has hosted murder always pretends afterward that it was merely the setting, never the accomplice. The body was removed first. There is always a strange, almost offensive courtesy in the way that happens. Voices drop, movements become careful. Men who have seen far worse behave as though restraint might somehow compensate for finality. Marcus Hollister left his house wrapped not in ribbon this time, but in regulation canvas, carried past a Christmas tree that no longer pretended to mean anything at all. The lights were still on when they took him out. No one thought to turn them off. They blinked steadily, colored bulbs reflecting faintly in the polished wood of the stairs where Marcus had fallen. Red, green, gold, cheerful colors doing an uncheerful job. Christmas does not withdraw its decorations simply because blood has been spilled beneath them. Tradition is stubborn that way. It survives on repetition, not conscience. The house seemed to notice his absence immediately. Sound changed. Space shifted. Even the air felt rearranged, as though something heavy had been removed from it, and it was still adjusting to the loss of pressure. The gift followed later. It was sealed in a clear evidence bag now. The green paper dulled by plastic, the bow flattened, the corners softened by handling. The tag still bore Marcus's name in handwriting that had outlived him by only a few days. A missing gift creates speculation. A returned one creates meaning. An evidence tag creates silence. The ledger had finished speaking. Now it would be catalogued, cited, footnoted, and eventually archived, its power reduced to precedent and paperwork. That reduction was justice of a sort. Julia Hollister did not watch it go. She stood at the window, hands folded loosely at her waist, her reflection overlapping the glass like a second life. She had narrowly avoided living. Her face held no drama now, only comprehension. She did not cry. She had done her crying earlier in private, where it would not be mistaken for performance or persuasion. When she finally turned away, it was with the composure of someone who understood that illusion is expensive, and she had already paid too much for it. She would endure. Wolfe had never doubted that. Endurance is not the same as happiness, but it is more reliable. Thomas Hollister left without saying goodbye. That, too, felt appropriate. Fear had been his most consistent companion, and fear does not linger once it has been exposed. It flees, or it hardens. It rarely reflects. He walked out with his shoulders hunched, already rehearsing explanations for people who would never ask him the right questions. He would survive, he always had. Survival was his only reliable skill, and even that had nearly failed him this time. Claire Keene paused at the door. She looked back once. Not at the tree, not at the stairs, but at the empty space beneath the branches where the gift had been. Her gaze lingered there briefly, not with regret, but with calculation. as though filing the image away as a reminder of what happens when business arrangements mistake themselves for permanence. She nodded slightly, as if acknowledging a conclusion reached without sentiment or relief, then stepped out into the cold. Claire would rebuild. She had the temperament for it. Some people are born with the ability to continue without needing absolution. The house, finally alone, seemed relieved. The tree lights were dimmed at last. Not ceremoniously, not together, but one string at a time, as though the house itself were growing tired. Darkness returned to the corners that had hosted too much certainty, and too many whispered calculations. Needles lay scattered beneath the branches, like punctuation marks at the end of a long, unwanted sentence. Christmas does not require belief to persist, only electricity and habit. By the time Wolfe and I left, the Hollister townhouse had returned to what it had always been beneath the trimmings, a structure that had held ambition comfortably and truth poorly. It would be sold eventually. Someone else would repaint the walls, replace the carpet, rearrange the furniture. Houses forget faster than people do. We took a cab. Wolfe does not comment during departures. He considers conclusions complete once spoken, and revisiting them offends his sense of order. He sat heavily, staring straight ahead, hands folded over his stomach, the city sliding past the window like an afterthought. Neon signs blurred into streaks of color. Pedestrians hurried with purpose that had nothing to do with homicide or consequence somewhere. Someone laughed too loudly for the hour, celebrating survival without knowing it. At West 35th Street, the brownstone greeted us with familiar restraint. Inside, the air smelled of orchids, polish and continuity. Theodore had done his work. Well, the plants upstairs were thriving, obedient to schedule and care, oblivious to financial crimes, shattered stairwells, and Christmas ultimatums. Wolfe paused in the hall, listening, not for sound, but for absence satisfied. He removed his coat and handed it to Fritz, who accepted it without comment, because Fritz understands closure better than most priests. "Beer," Wolfe said. "Yes, sir," Fritz replied, already moving. I poured the drinks myself later in the office. 2 glasses this time. That was my contribution to ceremony. Wolfe rarely comments on such things, but he notices them, files them away with everything else that confirms order has been restored. He took his without comment, settling into his chair with the air of a man reclaiming rightful territory. He took a long swallow, then another, then set the glass down precisely where it belonged, aligning it with the edge of the desk, as though geometry itself mattered again. "Well," I said, raising mine, "another holiday ruined properly." "Yes," Wolfe said, efficiently. We sat in silence for a moment, the kind that doesn't need filling. Outside, New York continued to be New York. Horns, voices, impatience, life refusing to pause for reflection or resolution. The city had already moved on. It always does. "Marcus Hollister," I said finally, "thought he could control people with information." Wolfe snorted. "A common error." "And Pike thought he could control the story," I added. "A worse one," Wolfe said. "Stories resent management. They behave badly when constrained." I smiled at that. Christmas didn't do anyone any favors this year. Wolfe regarded his glass thoughtfully, as though considering whether Christmas ever truly does. "Christmas," he said at last, "is resilient, people are not." Upstairs an orchid bloomed on schedule. That seemed about right. We finished our drinks. Fritz announced dinner. Wolfe rose. The day already filed away, labeled, cross, referenced and shelved with ruthless efficiency. Tomorrow would bring orchids, meals, and new problems demanding structure. Christmas survived. It always does. People, as usual, had to make their own arrangements.